The first time I saw him, he was standing in the rain outside the Rideau Center, talking on his phone like the weather was a personal insult he'd decided to ignore. I wasn't supposed to be looking. I was supposed to be getting back to the conservation lab at the Canadian Museum of History before my lunch break turned into a disciplinary conversation with my supervisor. I had half a smoked meat sandwich in my bag and a 17th century Haudenosaunee wampum belt waiting on my work table, and neither of those things cared that a man in a charcoal wool coat was standing in the November rain looking like he owned the sidewalk. I looked anyway. Then the light changed and I crossed the street, and I forgot about him entirely. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, he was sitting across from me in the break room on the 3rd floor, and I understood that forgetting him had been a temporary condition. "You're the conservator," he said. "Not a question." "I'm a conservator," I said. "There are 4 of us." He had dark eyes and the kind of jaw that suggested he'd never apologized for taking up space. He was holding a coffee from the cart downstairs. The bad coffee, the kind the rest of us complained about constantly, and drinking it like it was perfectly acceptable. "I need something from you," he said. I looked at my sandwich. I looked at him. "This is the break room. I know where I am." His name was Sebastian. I found that out later from my colleague Janet, who had apparently recognized him immediately and spent the intervening 2 days waiting for me to bring it up. Sebastian Harlow. The Harlow family ran half the private security infrastructure in eastern Canada. Legitimate contracts with federal ministries, defense procurement, private intelligence. The kind of company that was mentioned in the Globe and Mail but never explained. "He's that Harlow," Janet said, leaning in my office doorway with her tea mug and the particular expression she wore when she felt I was being dangerously oblivious. "His brother's getting married this weekend. Some huge thing at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier. It's been in the society pages. I don't read the society pages. I know. That's why I'm telling you." What Janet didn't tell me, what I had to piece together myself, later, when I had more information than I wanted, and significantly fewer options than I'd started with, was why Sebastian Harlow had come to the Canadian Museum of History on a Thursday in November to sit in the break room and drink bad coffee across from someone who restored old things for a living. He came back Friday morning. This time he came to the lab. I was working on a set of 19th century trade ledgers, consolidating loose pages that had started to separate along their spine folds. It was delicate work. I was wearing magnifying loupes and I had a brush the width of a finger in my hand, and I was, genuinely, annoyed when I heard the door. "We're not open to the public," I said, without turning around. "I'm not the public." I set the brush down. I turned around. He was standing just inside the door in a dark suit, no tie, looking at the room like he was cataloging it. The ventilation hummed. The fluorescent lights were doing what they always did, which was making everyone look slightly unwell. "You need to make an appointment," I said. "I did." "With you. Just now. That's not how appointments work." He looked at me for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair, my chair, from my work table, and sat down like I'd offered it. "I need someone to come with me to my brother's wedding tomorrow," he said, "as my date." The word date sat between us like something that had fallen off a shelf. "You came to a conservation lab," I said slowly, "to ask a stranger to your brother's wedding. You're not a stranger. I had you looked into. That's significantly worse." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Your name is May Sutherland. You have a PhD from Carleton in Material Culture Studies. You've worked here for 6 years. You have no criminal record, no significant debt, and your neighbor's cat is currently staying at your apartment because she's in Kelowna visiting her daughter." I stared at him. "The cat's name is Butterscotch," he said. "According to the note on your fridge." "You haven't seen my fridge." "No," he agreed. "But the woman who coordinates building access mentioned it when I spoke to her this morning." I should have said no. The rational version of me. The version that had spent 6 years carefully reconstructing fragile things and understood, professionally and personally, that you couldn't rush a repair. Should have said no, thank you, goodbye, please don't come back without an appointment. Instead I said, "Why me?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the single high window, I could hear a delivery truck idling in the service lane. "Because I don't know who I can trust, he said. And someone I don't know at all is safer than someone I've known for years. That should have been a warning. I know that now. At the time, sitting in my lab at 10:30 on a Friday morning with magnifying loupes still pushed up on my forehead, it just sounded like the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. I went home that afternoon and stood in my kitchen for a while, looking at Butterscotch, who was asleep on my dish towel and deeply indifferent to my situation. I texted my friend Hannah, who responded with a string of increasingly enthusiastic emojis that were not helpful. I opened my closet and looked at the one formal dress I owned. Navy blue, floor length, bought for a colleague's gallery opening 2 years ago. And I thought about the fact that I had absolutely no context for what I was agreeing to. Then I went anyway. The Fairmont Chateau Laurier was, that Saturday evening, the most beautifully lit building in Ottawa, which is saying something in a city full of buildings that know how to present themselves. The ballroom had been done in white and gold, the kind of wedding that cost more per table than I made in a month. And the guests were the sort of people who wore their wealth quietly, in the cut of a jacket or the understated weight of a watch. Sebastian was waiting for me in the lobby. He'd changed into a black tuxedo, and he looked objectively like trouble. "You came," he said. I said I would. He offered his arm. I took it because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The ceremony was in the smaller ballroom. His brother Connor was tall and openly nervous. His nouvelle wife Isabel was composed and radiant, and the whole thing was genuinely moving in a way I hadn't expected. I sat beside Sebastian and watched a couple promise themselves to each other in front of 200 people, and I thought about how strange it was to be a stranger at the most intimate moment of someone else's life. "He looks happy," I said quietly. "He is," Sebastian said. Something in his voice was careful. At dinner, I was seated at a table with a man named Victor, a business partner, Sebastian had said, someone he'd worked with for years, and Victor's wife, and 2 other couples whose names I immediately lost in the noise of the room. Victor was in his late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular warmth of someone who had spent decades making people feel at ease. He asked about my work. He asked the right questions. I found myself explaining the Wampum Belt project. And he listened attentively, genuinely curious, and I thought, I like this man. That was about 2 hours before everything fell apart. I was in the corridor outside the ballroom, having stepped out to call Janet. Not for any particular reason except that I suddenly wanted to hear a familiar voice, when I saw Sebastian coming toward me from the far end of the hall. He was moving quickly. His expression had changed. "We need to leave," he said. "The wedding isn't. Now." May, I'd known him for less than 48 hours. I didn't know why I followed him. I followed him. We went through a service corridor and out through a side entrance into the cold November night. His car was already there. His driver, a man named Patrick who I'd met briefly that afternoon, had the engine running. "What's happening?" I asked. Sebastian was on his phone. He held up one finger. "Wait." And I stood on the sidewalk in my navy dress and heels with the Ottawa River cold in the air, and I thought, this is, objectively, not something that happens to conservators. In the car, he finally looked at me directly. "There's a problem with the company. Someone inside has been moving information. Tonight was supposed to be. They were going to use the wedding. Too many people in one place. Everyone distracted." "Use it how?" He didn't answer immediately. "Sebastian, there are documents," he said. "Evidence of contracts that shouldn't exist. Someone's been building a case. Not for the courts, for leverage. And tonight, they were planning to hand them off. To who? That's what I don't know yet." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, Parliament Hill was lit up against the dark sky, and Ottawa looked, as it always did, like a city that kept its serious business out of sight. "You thought Victor," I said. He looked at me sharply. "You put me at his table," I said. "You wanted me to talk to him. You were watching." A pause. "You're perceptive." "I work with things that have been damaged and repaired so many times the original material is almost gone," I said. "You learn to look at what's underneath." What happened next is not something I'm entirely willing to set down in careful sequence, because even now my memory of it has the quality of something I'm still processing. What I can say is this: it wasn't Victor. Victor, it turned out, had been trying to warn Sebastian for 3 weeks through channels that someone inside the company had already compromised. The man who had been building the leverage file, who had been quietly collecting evidence of gray area contracts and planning to sell that information to a competitor with a very different set of ethics, was someone Sebastian had known for 15 years. Someone he'd promoted twice. Someone who had been at the table on Sebastian's other side all evening, talking about Connor's wedding and making the right noises about family. His name was Greg. I'd spoken to him for maybe 10 minutes. Greg, as it turned out, had already made the handoff. He'd done it before the ceremony, in the parking structure, in the time between when guests arrived and when everything began. He'd been planning it for months. The wedding was cover, everyone watching the couple at the front, nobody watching two men exchange a hard drive near the elevator bank on level 2. By the time Sebastian understood the full shape of it, Patrick had driven us to an office building in Canada where Sebastian had secure servers. And I was sitting in a boardroom at midnight in a formal dress, drinking coffee from a machine that was marginally better than the one at the museum, watching Sebastian make phone calls in a language that was technically English, but felt like something I wasn't cleared to understand. At one point he came and sat down across from me, and he looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like someone who was tired. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't expect it to go this way tonight." "What did you expect?" "I expected to introduce you to some people and have you tell me afterward what you noticed. You're trained to observe detail, I thought." He stopped. "I thought having someone with fresh eyes in the room would help me figure out where the problem was." "You used me as a diagnostic tool," I said. "Yes. I thought about that. That's a strange way to ask someone to a wedding." "I know. Did it work?" He looked at me. "You noticed that Victor was worried. Before dinner, when he shook your hand, you told me he seemed tense under the surface." I had said that. I'd said it quietly, between the appetizer and the main course, because Victor had laughed a little too freely and his hands had been too still. "That told me where to look," Sebastian said. "Not at Victor. At whoever was watching Victor. The information that had been taken was recovered, eventually. I don't know the details of how, and I didn't ask. What I know is that by 2 a.m, the immediate crisis had resolved into something Sebastian's legal team and a very specific division of the RCMP would handle over the following weeks. Greg had been intercepted before he left the city. The hard drive was recovered. Connor and Isabel, still at the Chateau Laurier in an oblivious bubble of champagne and first dance joy, knew nothing about any of it. Patrick drove me home at 2:30. Sebastian came with me, which I hadn't expected. We sat in the car outside my building for a moment after Patrick stopped. The street was quiet. There was a light on in the apartment above mine. My upstairs neighbor kept strange hours. "Butterscotch will want feeding," I said. "Probably." This was not a normal evening. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." I looked at him. He was looking at the building, not avoiding my eyes, just thinking. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." 15 years, I said. "You trusted someone for 15 years and he was building a case against you for, how long? Months?" 8 months. Maybe longer. "And you didn't know?" "No," he said. "I didn't know." Outside, a taxi went by on the wet pavement. November in Ottawa had a particular sound. Tires on damp asphalt, the particular silence that settles around 2 a.m. "That's the part that's hard," I said. Not as a consolation, just as a fact. He turned and looked at me, and for a moment his expression was something I didn't have a category for. Not the careful blankness he'd worn all evening. Something more like a question he wasn't sure he should ask. "You're very calm," he said. "For someone who just spent 6 hours in the middle of a situation that had nothing to do with her." "I restore things for a living," I said. "You get used to finding out that something you thought was stable has been compromised for a long time without anyone noticing. You just figure out what's actually still intact and work from there." He was quiet for a moment. "What's still intact?" he asked. "Your brother got married today," I said, "and he didn't know anything went wrong. That's intact." Something in Sebastian's expression shifted. It was small. Someone else might have missed it. "Good night, May," he said. "Good night." I got out of the car and went upstairs, and Butterscotch was waiting by the door with the particular intensity of a cat who has decided that midnight is an appropriate time for breakfast. I fed her. I stood in my kitchen in my navy dress and my bare feet. I'd taken the heels off in the elevator. And I thought about the fact that I'd just spent the strangest 6 hours of my adult life, and felt, underneath all of it, more awake than I had in months. My phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't have saved. The museum has a gala in December. I've been asked to sit on the foundation board. I'll need someone who can tell me when the paintings are real and when the room is. I read it twice. Then I looked at Butterscotch, who had finished eating and was now sitting on my counter with the regal indifference of someone who had seen everything and judged most of it. "Don't," I told her. She blinked. I typed back. "Conservators charge consulting fees." The response came in under 30 seconds. "I know. Send me your rate." I set my phone down on the counter. I looked out my kitchen window at the Ottawa night. The lights across the river in Gatineau. The particular darkness that comes after 2 a.m. in a city that keeps most of its business very quiet. I thought about a man who didn't know who he could trust, and how the only person he'd been willing to bring into a room was someone who understood, professionally, that the most damaged things were often the ones that looked perfectly fine from the outside. I picked my phone back up. I sent him my rate.